50 years ago, an American president made a journey that would be described as ice-breaking. It culminated in the release of the China-U.S. joint communique and led eventually to the establishment of diplomatic relations. Given their differences, how did China and the US come to agree this historic communique?
The walls that are erected, whether they are physical walls like this, or whether they are other walls of ideology or philosophy, will not divide peoples in the world. So, how relevant are this communique's 5 principles today? CGTN presents Cornerstone. At 11:30 in the morning of Monday, February the 21st, 1972, Air Force One touched down in Beijing. On board was US President Richard Nixon. In a scene that has lived long in the memory, he descended from the plane and extended his hand to Premier Zhou Enlai, standing at the foot of the stairs. The two remained shaking hands for a full minute in an image that was flashed around the world.
The first handshake was between President Nixon and Premier Zhou Enlai on the tarmac at the Shoudu Jichang. And yes, there was such a feeling because the main purpose of the trip was to open a relationship with China. And just by reaching across to shake each other's hands, we symbolized the beginning of that process.
If there was a postscript that I hope might be written with regard to this trip, it would be the words on the plaque which was left on the moon by our first astronauts when they landed there. We came in peace for all mankind.
Americans at that time knew little about China, and for many of them this visit was no less remarkable than the moon landing. Later, on March the 6th, 1972, Time magazine carried a cover story under the headline, Nixon's China Odyssey, a choice of words that hinted at the historic and visionary nature of the trip.
President Nixon proposed this opening because he thought the American people needed a vision of peace rather than the conflicts in Indochina that were raging at the time. And because Chairman Mao and Premier Zhou Enlai on the Chinese thought that the security of China would be enhanced by becoming part of the international diplomatic system.
For more than 2 decades since the founding of the PRC, the relationship between the two countries had been frozen with virtually no contact. So, why had they chosen this moment to break the ice?
中国和美国都有这个需要，要打开，对抗格局了。从美国方面来说，最主要的原因有2个，一个是越南战争，另外一个就是美苏之间的竞争。我们要来改善我们的国际环境，那么改善国际环境里头呢，这个地方的牛鼻子就是打开跟美国的关系。
Nixon's historic visit opened the way for China and the United States to enter a new era of dialogue and exchange. Having reviewed the Guard of Honor, Zhou and Nixon shared a limousine to the Diaoyutai State Guest House. Less than half an hour after the US delegation's arrival there, Zhou informed them that Chairman Mao had requested an immediate meeting with President Nixon. The encounter took place later that day, around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, in Mao's residence at Zhongnanhai.
It had been reported in the foreign press that on way to China, President Nixon had mentioned to the press the day before he arrived that his discussions with the Chinese leaders would be from a philosophical point of view, rather than concentrating on immediate issues. That news report had been translated into Chinese and caught the attention of the chairman. Therefore, at the beginning of their meeting, he picked up that point and smilingly noted that President Nixon had created a problem by confining their discussions to philosophical issues, which produced a round of laughter among those present.
The meeting, originally scheduled for 15 to 20 minutes, lasted for more than an hour. The two men showed great respect for each other on a personal level and as leaders of two great countries, and, through their conversation, laid out a broad and long-term vision. After the founding of the PRC in 1949, the United States had attempted to contain and isolate China. However, Mao Zedong and the Chinese leadership had never accepted that the United States would always be an enemy. So they paid close attention to US foreign policy, noting any shift, however slight, in the US attitude towards China. On January the 20th, 1969, in his inaugural address as president, Nixon stated his intention to improve bilateral relations. Subsequently, when the new American administration showed signs of disengaging from Vietnam and withdrawing from Asia, Chairman Mao decided that an historic opportunity was presenting itself.
从69年下半年以后，中国跟美国双方都主动在通过各种途径来进行试探，那么一直到后来1971年7月，基辛格实现了对中国的秘密访问。
National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger's first trip to China was both secret and dramatic. With the enthusiastic help of Pakistani President Yahya Khan, Kissinger feigned illness during a trip to Pakistan. While supposedly recuperating, he traveled in secret to China. He arrived in Beijing at midday on July the 9th and left at midday on July the 11th. He spent no fewer than 17 of those 48 hours in talks with Premier Zhou Enlai. Kissinger had his first meeting with Zhou on the afternoon of July the 9th, just 4 hours after his arrival in Beijing. This, and subsequent discussions between the two men, as well as a series of other meetings over the following months between the two countries' officials, would eventually lead to the release of the Sino-U.S. joint communique, or Shanghai Communique, on February the 28th, 1972. Kissinger used his first meeting with Zhou to explain the relevant aspects of US foreign policy to the Chinese premier. A main focus of their discussions was the Taiwan issue.
基辛格的访华，它其实具有一个定调的意义，特别是关于台湾问题上，美国对这个问题他认为是未定的，它是要有待历史进一步解决的。但是到了1971年，基辛格秘密访华的时候，就重新调整了美国的对台政策，也就承认台湾是中国的一个部分，美国是不支持台独的。
Taiwan had been a sensitive issue in Sino-U.S. relations ever since the end of the Chinese Civil War in the late 1940s, when the US had continued its support for Chiang Kai-shek and the Kuomintang after their retreat to the island. On June 27, 1950, the US had used the outbreak of the Korean War 2 days earlier as a pretext for sending its 7th Fleet into the Taiwan Strait. And in December 1954, the United States and Taiwan had signed a mutual defense treaty.
台湾问题的本质就是一句话，就是一个中国原则。第一个部分呢是说这个世界上那么只有一个中国，台湾是中国的一个部分。中华人民共和国政府是中国唯一的合法性代表政府。第二个非常重要的方面就是台湾问题是我们中国的内政问题，是国共内战延续的一个产物。那么第三个非常重要的就是反对分裂的问题。
3 months after his first secret visit, Kissinger returned to China on October the 20th, 1971. But this time, he did not shy away from international media attention. The open contact between the two great powers made headlines around the world. Zhou and Kissinger spent more than 25 hours together debating the world situation. The US presented a draft of a joint communique. In his memoir, White House Years, Kissinger provided a fascinating insight into the thinking behind this draft.
Dr. Kissinger later described it as following, quote, the conventional style, highlighting fuzzy areas of agreement and obscuring differences with platitudinous generalizations. In this case, it clearly implied more common ground than actually existed, unquote.
However, Premier Zhou flatly rejected this approach.
他的这个草稿里头呢，就像一般的这个外交文件似的，把双方的分歧就模模糊糊的就淡化了，好像双方几乎都是共识。那么周呢就很明确的提出来了，我们格局了20多年啊，双方对许多重大国际问题的看法都不一样，我们怎么能够发表这么一个外交文件呢？啊，所以中方提出来就是在对许多重大国际问题的看法上各说各话，中方是什么意思，美方是什么意思？
After consideration, the Chinese side produced a draft of a completely different format. It first laid out the different views of each side on international issues. China's views written out, U.S. views left for the American side to fill in. Then, the common views of both sides. It went on in the same manner with regard to bilateral issues.
Kissinger described his reaction to China's proposal in his book On China. He wrote, "At first I was taken aback, but as I reflected, the unorthodox format appeared to solve both sides' problem. Each could reaffirm its fundamental convictions, which would reassure domestic audiences and uneasy allies. The differences have been known for 2 decades. The contrast would highlight the agreements being reached, and the positive conclusions would be far more credible." This unprecedented approach served to clearly set out the position of the two sides. On October the 25th, 1971, just as Kissinger was about to wrap up his second visit to Beijing, China passed another significant diplomatic milestone when the People's Republic resumed its seat at the United Nations.
Voting is as follows: in favor 76, opposed 35, abstention 17. The draft resolution adopted. The government of People's Republic of China will be notified accordingly.
当时尼克松还没有访问，但是1971年7月基辛格访问了。基辛格访问了以后呢，这个事情就公开了，而且7月下旬呢也说了，尼克松要在第2年5月之前访问中国，所以中美走向破冰，中美走向和解，这个已经成为世界上的一件大事。那么对各国政府实际上都会产生的影响。
利用这个机会，代表中国人民向远在大洋彼岸的美国人民致以亲切的问候。中美两国的社会制度根本不同，在中美两国政府之间存在着巨大的分歧，但 但是，这种分歧不应当妨碍中美两国在互相尊重主权和领土完整、互不侵犯、互不干涉内政、平等互利和和平共处无抗原则的基础上建立正常的国家关系。我们希望通过双方坦率的交换意见，弄清楚彼此之间分歧，努力寻找共同点，使我们两国的关系能够有一个新的开始。
Mr. Prime Minister and all of your distinguished guests this evening, on behalf of all of your American guests, I wish to thank you for the incomparable hospitality.
During Nixon's visit, he and Zhou Enlai held 4 meetings, lasting a total of 12 hours. They discussed various bilateral issues between China and the United States. Once Zhou and Nixon had set the tone, it was left to Kissinger and Chinese Vice Foreign Minister Qiao Guanhua to work out the details of a communique. However, reaching agreement on the wording was a sometimes tortuous process. The Qiao-Kissinger discussions on the communique, sandwiched between other diplomatic events, were spread across 11 rounds, sometimes lasting late into the night, and extending for over 20 hours over 5 days.
They were both quite seasoned in their trade and stuck to their principles while striving to achieve something acceptable to both. It was said that at one point, the Chinese side declared it would be all right to have no communique at all, and his opposite number would at times frown and chew on his pencil. But still, both labored for a final result that would satisfy both sides.
For both countries, there needed to be a formal statement. Now, for Richard Nixon, it was important because he was talking to Chinese communists, and people back in America would not understand. So he had traveled to China and met with Zhou Enlai and Mao Zedong, but he failed. That would be a terrible result for him, politically very costly. So he needed some form of agreement to say, we have a success.
The major stumbling block in the negotiations was how to address the Taiwan issue. After considerable back and forth discussion, the two sides arrived at what has become a well-known form of words. What the US eventually agreed to was the statement, "The United States acknowledges that all Chinese on either side of the Taiwan Strait maintain there is but one China and that Taiwan is a part of China. The United States government does not challenge that position."
Most important was that the United States acknowledged that the Chinese people consider Taiwan a part of China and that there was only one China and that we would not challenge that proposition. At the same time, Chairman Mao made it clear that the Taiwan problem might require a long period for a final resolution.
Considerable time was devoted to deliberations on a preliminary statement concerning the One China principle.
The statement was extremely critical. It's intentionally ambiguous, and it doesn't say the People's Republic of China. But at the time, in 1972, the assumption was, I think on both sides, the United States was not going to be actively involved in interfering in China relations, China's internal politics, specifically Taiwan policy, and that it would both withdraw military support and cease to recognize Taiwan as representing China.
这段话里头啊，美国一方面承认了一个中国，承认了台湾是中国的一部分，但另一方面，这段话里头的中国的含义还是不明确的、不清楚的啊。那么什么时候清楚了呢？到 1978年12月发表中美建交公报的时候，美方承认中华人民共和国政府是代表全中国的唯一合法政府。这个上海公报、建交公报跟817公报这个3个公报是一个整体，一个中国的原则是体现在这个3个公报当中。美国方面对一个中国原则的确认，是一步一步的越来越明确和越来越加强的。
Apart from Taiwan, the two sides set out their stance on several other issues.
首先一条就是国家之间不管你社会制度怎么样，怎么不同，但是呢都要用和平共处5项原则来处理国家与国家之间的关系，不能使用武力或者是用武力相威胁。那么根据这样一个原则，我们进一步的认为，就中美关系正常化，不但是符合中美2国人民的利益，而且是符合全世界人民的利益。另外一个原则呢，就是反霸，这个2国都不谋求霸权，或都反对任何国家谋求霸权的努力。
What we both agree on, and we both agreed to resist hegemony. And so once that was established, then we need to find the language in the communique to tell the whole world that this is the basis for our cooperation opposing hegemony. And that clause in the Shanghai Communique that the United States and China resist hegemony and oppose hegemony was the key issue for other countries too. Because when other countries read that communique, they didn't want to look at the differences. They want to know what brought us together.
At 2 a.m. on February the 26th, 1972, just before Nixon's departure from Beijing for Hangzhou, the text of the communique was finally completed and approved. However, while Nixon was on the way to Hangzhou, there was a last-minute twist. Officials from the U.S. State Department, who had accompanied him to China, expressed dissatisfaction with the communique and demanded as many as 15 revisions.
Vice Minister Qiao Guanghua was astonished at such an action, particularly after the draft had been approved by the CPC Political Bureau and the President of the United States, and he sharply voiced his disagreement. However, he reported to Premier Zhou Enlai, who consulted with Chairman Mao Zedong. The final result was that the Chinese side flatly rejected any change in the wording regarding Taiwan and accepted all the other minor amendments.
In the small hours of February the 27th, the final draft of the Sino-U.S. joint communique was agreed in Hangzhou's Liuzhuang Hotel. On the afternoon of February the 28th, 1972, at the Jinjiang Hotel in Shanghai, in the glare of the world media spotlight, the heads of the Chinese and American governments issued the Sino-U.S. joint communique. The document laid the cornerstone for building exchange and cooperation between the two countries.
Of the Shanghai Communique is that it opened up a means of communication which recognized the profound differences in ideology and governmental systems, but made it possible to expand in terms of trade, finance, integration, economic integration, etc. It's in some way has become the foundations for the relationship between the two countries.
The conclusion of the Shanghai Communique initiated the process of normalizing the Sino-U.S. relationship. Over the following 7 years, several rounds of discussions and negotiations were held, leading to the conclusion of a further communique in December 1978, which confirmed that diplomatic relations would be established as of January 1st, 1979. The adoption of the Shanghai Communique ushered in a new, more dynamic period of Chinese diplomacy. In Japan, Kakue Tanaka, after becoming Prime Minister in 1972,
initiated a process that led to normalizing bilateral relations. The normalization of China-U.S. relations brought extensive and far-reaching positive changes to the broader international landscape.
中美两国和解了，所以亚洲的冷战比全世界的冷战早了10几年就结束了，这一点非常的重要。这一点就为亚洲这个和平稳定，为亚洲东亚地区的这个发展，提供了一个非常良好的一个政治环境和安全环境。所以从那个时候开始，一直到现在，这个东亚地区都是世界上最富有活力、最富有生气、经济发展最迅速的地区之一。
50 years ago, the leaders of China and the United States opened a new chapter in relations based on the common interests of the two countries. History has shown their actions to be far-sighted. 50 years later, the mutual isolation between the two countries has been transformed into intertwined interests. With its strategic significance and global impact becoming more pronounced over the years, the China-U.S. relationship is today one of the most important bilateral relationships in the world. Respecting each other and conducting dialogue and cooperation on the basis of peaceful coexistence, as enshrined in the Shanghai Communiqué, are principles that are as relevant today as they were 50 years ago.